You may have heard me say in this series or one of the other 69 or so that I've authored that there's a difference between data and information. Data is just stuff, and information is what we get when we put that stuff into context and make it meaningful to ourselves. SharePoint assists us in this endeavor in numerous ways. When planned and designed with forethought, sites, lists, and libraries are organized into logical collections of information. Lists are composed of meaningful columns of data, not just a bunch of stuff that someone wants us to type in that will never be used. Lists will also contain enough information to be useful, but not so much that it's cumbersome and wasteful of our time. Despite all these efforts, what I can still guarantee is that within an organization, there will be about a dozen or more ways that people will want and need to see the same data. That's when it gets tricky. Usually does when people become involved, but it's understandable. If I have data in a spreadsheet that I created, and I created it in a way that makes sense to me, that's great, as long as I'm the only one who uses it. But as soon as someone else needs it, with a slightly different spin or need for the data, they get irritated because it's not organized the way that makes sense to them. Maybe they need it sorted differently, or maybe they could care less about transactions that were more than 30 days ago. It's hard to say, but the more users we have, the more complicated keeping everyone happy gets. The key still is to have one single point of data entry, one place we're going to keep our information, and for us that's SharePoint. We don't want 2 or 5 or 12 different copies of the data just so everyone gets it their way. But enter SharePoint views. Views are reusable configurations of the columns that we want to see, with items filtered by our criteria, sorted in the way that we want, and even with grouping and totals added in. Every list must have at least one view. Every list has one, but only one default view that displays when the list is initially opened. SharePoint lists also now have a default mobile view, which is a simplified view that will display well on smaller screens like on smartphones and tablets. Most of the lists that come with SharePoint have views built in, and most of those will be just fine for most of our needs. So let's see what we can do with different views of our lists. We're currently looking at a task list called Curriculum Design Projects that's in our You Got It training site. We want to take a look at the views that come built in. Haven't done anything special with it. These are just the things that are already available. That means as users, all we have to do is apply the views. One way to do that is from the top of the list. Below where it says New Task or Edit this list, you'll see a few of the default views that are built in. Most lists have something called All, in this case, All Tasks. And that is just what it sounds like. It just displays every entry that's in the list in the order in which it was entered. If a list has a field with a date column, then it might also provide a calendar view. If you take a look at our list now, it is just a simple text-based list. But if we click or tap on Calendar, we'll see that it now is displayed in a calendar format, which might be more useful or easier to use. I did want to point out that for any of our calendar views, we do get a contextual tab. On the upper left-hand side of the screen, there's now a Calendar tab. And from this tab, we can do things like change it from a daily view to a weekly view or to a monthly view. There also, of course, is a tab for the list. The List tab gives us another place we can apply views. Instead of having to apply them from the main screen itself, we can move to the Manage Views group and select from the drop-down under Current View. We've taken a look at all tasks. Now we're taking a look at Calendar. Now let's take a look at all of the completed tasks in this list. This puts us back to a generic text or standard view, but now it's filtered, and it's filtered to only show tasks that have been marked as complete. So we can use the ribbon, or we can use the options that we see right below the Edit Task or Edit This List, but don't forget, we also have the ellipsis button. This gives us more options, more views that wouldn't fit across the screen. There's one called a Gantt chart, which for you project people shows us not only the duration of each task as the length of a bar, but also how tasks relate to each other. In other words, if they overlap, then they're supposed to happen concurrently. Project management people love this, but it really is a good, useful view for a lot of other uses as well. Let's make just a couple more trips to the ellipsis. There's also an entry for late tasks, things that are currently past due. There's a view that will simply filter out my tasks, in other words, tasks that have been assigned to me. Upcoming tasks will filter out and only show us tasks that are coming up in the near future. In other words, not something that's due a year from now. You may or may not see some additional options here at the bottom, like modify this view or create views. The availability of these two options will depend on your permissions in this list. If you don't have permissions to modify or work with views, or your own personal views, then these may not show up at all. If you do, then you can go ahead and click on them and create or modify the views to your heart's content. The point here is just to remember that there are many different ways to look at the same data. None are right or wrong, but most SharePoint lists come with several different views to sort or filter things the way that you need to see them to make it useful for what you're doing at the moment. A couple of things again before we leave this view and figure out what we've already learned, which is to make sure that you look for those contextual tabs. Now that we're in the Gantt chart, we actually have a timeline contextual tab. Also remember that you can work with the List tab itself to apply views or work with any of the other view options that you may have based on your permissions. It doesn't matter where you work from, they all work the same way. Remember, though, that we also have a couple of different types of views in SharePoint. The default view is the one that will always show up when you first open the list. Public views are those that are available to anybody who uses this list, and they're generally created by administrators. You may also see a category called Personal Views. Those are views that you have created, but they are available only for your own use. What you now know is that views are one of the ways we organize data into information in SharePoint. They're reusable configurations of what columns you want to see, in what order across the screen, and how you want the items to be sorted, filtered, grouped, and/or totaled within the list. We've worked with ones that have already been created for us, but you can also create your own. Views can be public, personal, or mobile. Administrators make public views, and everyone with access to the list can see and use them. Individuals like yourself can make personal views, but they are the only ones who can see or use them. Every list must have at least one view. Most will have many. Every list must have one, but it can have only one default view, the one that opens or displays when you first open the list. Views are applied from links at the top of the list, below the list title, or from the List tab of the ribbon.